Good afternoon, Grace Community Chapel family. I'm happy to be back with you today. I was laughing with Alyssa today, talking about when I get a chance to record these. You may or may not realize that all of these are done live. So, when I'm actually going to do it is really tricky because some days I try to get it done early in the morning before I get on my day. But some days I'm out super early, and so there's just not an opportunity to record throughout the day as I'm in various meetings with different people. So today we're coming at you at 6:20 because that's the way the day went. I'm hoping to do one a little bit earlier tomorrow. But we're in Ecclesiastes, and we've been going through the book of Ecclesiastes. And for those of you who are familiar, I've kind of taken an approach from some of you. You might view that as new. That Qoheleth, the preacher, the author of the book, is probably not Solomon, although he does try to depict himself in some ways similar to Solomon, and in a lot of ways then gives us some wisdom that is almost anti-proverbial, anti-Solomon. And now, as we've been getting in, he's been talking about death, and he's been talking about the evil of what death is, and ultimately the Hebel, the enigmatic nature of life under the sun, that we cannot know the things that are almost imperative for us to know in the life under the sun. And so he's concluded in chapter 9, ultimately, that as we were kind of getting towards the end of that, he says that I've seen this example of wisdom under the sun, talks about a city with few men and a great king come against it, and that there was this poor wise man, and he delivered the city with his wisdom, yet nobody remembered. And he said, ultimately, the words of the wise, heard and quiet, are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. And so here in chapter 10, we see another set of proverbs that are going to be given by Qoheleth to the people who are reading his writing now. And so it's kind of a string of different proverbs, different than the ones that we saw in chapter 7, and we'll go ahead and take a look at those as we move through. Starting in chapter 10, verse 1. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offense to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in the low. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of the wise man win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. And the beginning of words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of the fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. So Qoheleth starts his string of wise sayings, and some of them seem disjointed, and some of them are jointed. Now, as we get towards the end of this book, he's going to draw a conclusion to all these proverbs. So at this point, it might feel like they're kind of nowhere. And they kind of don't have a direction. And it's similar to what we would see in some of the book of Proverbs, although some of these, again, are almost described as anti-Proverbs. But there's some good wisdom that we find in a lot of these. In chapter 10, verse 1, this one seems to make some pretty clear sense. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. The idea is that a little bit something small that is dead and is of no good, ultimately ruins a whole a mass of perfumer's ointment, which would give off a strong fragrance, but yet a small dead fly would be enough to change the odor into something foul. And so the idea is that a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. You can have tons of wisdom and honor. However, if you engage in a little folly, it outweighs all of the rest of it. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Now, I know that some people of certain political persuasions like to use this as an example of why you should be on the right and not the left, and that's funny, but that's not what this is saying. The idea being that, again, living in a right-handed dominant society, there's kind of this general idea that the right is always the right direction, and the left is always the wrong, in a sense. And so it's more of contrasting. A wise man's heart leads him to what's right, but a fool's is always leading them to what's wrong. And that's kind of the idea. And they're giving this idea of the concept of the road, so that way, as he comes into verse 3, he says, even when the fool walks in the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he's a fool. And the idea being that the way that the fool is walking and how he's walking and where he's going, it's evident to everyone as they watch his life that he's a fool. And he might not think he's a fool. He might think he's fine. But when you witness the fruit of his life and you witness how he walks down the road, and this is referring to his life and the decisions that he makes in his life, everyone who walks by him can see that he lacks sense. And he says to everyone that he's a fool, because his actions and his thoughts and his words communicate his foolishness. And so it's like the person who's walking down the road having no clue where they're going, and yet they're asserting that they know exactly where they're going. And anyone that knows where they're going sees that they're a fool. I think about this in reference to hiking. I don't know if you've ever been hiking. And for those of you who hike regularly, and you maybe been on the same hiking path multiple times, you might have an idea on how the path turns and bends, and when you're at a peak of a mountain versus when you're not. And it's interesting because, someone who's never been on the path before, they might come from the perspective, oh, it's just around this bend, or it's just around this next bend, and we'll be at the finish at the top. And in a sense, it's that idea that everyone who knows that person isn't aware, and that's the same idea. On the path of life, this fool doesn't know that he's a fool, but he's making it demonstrated to everyone around him. Verse 4, if the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place. The idea being that if the ruler's upset with you, stay calm and leave where you are. Like, stay where you are. Let the time heal the wound, and don't create any conflict. And you will lay great offenses to rest. And this is a great concept for sometimes, we insist on getting involved when there's conflict. And, certainly in the church, there's clear policies around if you erred against your brother, go to him and declare your fault and fix it. But differencing when it's the anger of a ruler, better off to let the ruler cool off and demonstrate your submission to him rather than continuing to create conflict. Then he goes into there's an evil that he sees under the sun. This is a consistent, kind of statement that he makes. And he says it's as if it were an air proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. Now, what he's saying here is that as he looks out in the world around him, things are upside down. Things aren't the way that you would expect them to be. And he says it's almost as if it's coming from the king and the ruler, and partially meaning God, and more meaning the king of the land. That folly is set in high places, and the rich sit in a low. Now, there's an assumption here that the rich are the wise, and that they are the ones who are able to take care, and they have wisdom, whereas those who are in the ruling places, the high places, are foolish and full of folly. Now, verse 6 and verse 5 gives us an indication again that Kohelet is not a king. He's not a ruler. In fact, he's looking at the ruler of the land and sees them as really foolish. Verse 7, another topsy-turvy, upside down. Slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Now, he's not making it a depiction on whether or not there should be slavery, whether or not there should be... He's not making any of those statements. All he's saying is that what you would expect, the people that you would expect, the wise and people who are respectable, he's like, those are the people who are walking on the ground. Those are the people that are treated like slaves, but yet the slaves, the people who are foolish, and the people who are, they're the one on the horses, they're the one in the high places. And it's in an upside down kind of world. And we would say that's because of the sin that entered the world. But continuing on, verse 8, we see, he who digs a pit will fall into it. Now, elsewhere in Proverbs and in Psalms, when this is mentioned, this is someone digging a pit with the intention of harming somebody else so that they might fall into it. And we see the scripture says that they will fall into the pit that they dig for others. I don't think that's what this is specifically talking about. Because we see the next one, the serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. So the digging of the pit here, I think, is a renovation project where you're digging a pit somewhere in your area of your home or of the town, a pit that's necessary for town development. Maybe it's for sewage or whatever else. The idea that you're trying to help and you're trying to do a work, you're trying to do a job, and in the course of doing that job, you end up falling in and getting hurt. Likewise, we see that someone who's breaking through a wall, trying to do some renovations in their home, serpents biting them. As they're trying to get this job done, they're breaking through this wall, and all of a sudden a serpent bites them. We see this concept continuing in verse 9. He who quarries stones is hurt by them. So someone's going out and they're trying to quarry up stones so that they can bring it into the city to build, and now he's hurt by him. Likewise, someone who splits logs is endangered by them. And there's this concept of that the work that we do, but yet we should toil, we should work, and yet it brings about our harm. And it almost seems like that's not how things should be. In fact, it would be safer to be lazy than in that case and not work at all. Which, is contrary to wisdom. However, that's kind of what he's saying here, is that it's an upside down kind of world. Then he says, if the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed. And he's kind of using in the sense of that in these situations and throughout the situations of life, a lot of times we just kind of keep pressing on, but really rather than using more strength, we need to stop and we need to process, we need to ask what is wise, because that's going to make things easier. It's going to make us have success. And then verse 11, he says that the serpent bites before it's charmed, there's no advantage to the charmer. Again, he's not saying we should be snake charmers. The idea being here that if you don't use wisdom in how you interact and how you do things, then you're going to get harmed, and it's ultimately not going to be to your benefit when you need to be seeking wisdom. And so that's the element that we see in verse 8, 9, and 10, and then ultimately into 11. In verse 12, we continue this idea. He says, the words of the wise man win him favor, but the lips of fools consume him. And this is the idea of that wisdom, really and truly, we see this all through the New Testament, is controlling your words, controlling your speech, controlling what you say, how you say it, and when you say it. And he says, the words of a wise man win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. It becomes his problem. The words of a wise man gain people to his side. The words of a fool actually result in his own destruction. And verse 13, the beginning of words in his mouth is foolishness. At the end, his talk is evil madness. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but there have been times in my life when I've been interacting with somebody, and there comes a point in time where their foolishness continues to the point where it's madness. And what you can tell is it's deranged. And so, there's this element to which we see this happen in the lives of fools. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what it is to be, and who can tell him what it'll be after him. This is the idea. We don't know where the fool's going with it, and we don't know what he's going to ultimately say, and who can tell ultimately what will be after him. Ultimately, what will the result be? Verse 15, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way of the city. And this is the idea of that in his foolishness, again, kind of like with the path that we saw before, the fool just worries himself and works himself up over foolish things, worries himself. He might not use wisdom in how he works in verses 8 through 11, or he might cause himself and struggle with his words, or he's just, due to his foolishness, it's evil madness to those who do listen. And so because of all this, he doesn't know the way to the city. That means after he's done working, he doesn't know how to get back home. And that's how foolish he is. He's just incapable of really leading a life that ultimately results in anything and gets anywhere. And so verse 16, he says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning." And this is more of talking about those foolish type people and type behaviors. And he says, when your king is a child, and this isn't, I don't necessarily think he's saying necessarily exactly when your king is a child, when he's saying, well, when your king's 12 years old. I think when he's saying when your king is a child, as in foolish like a child. And when your king has no wisdom and is a fool, that's a woe to the land. And likewise, when your princes feast in the morning, that means that they get up and they're eating tons of food. He says, contrastly, happy are you when your king is the son of nobility. This is someone who's well understood, raised in wisdom, all of those things. That's what's being talked about there, as opposed to someone who's foolish, who's childish. And then he says, your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not drunkenness. And this is the idea that the prince feasting in the morning, it's about getting drunk in the very beginning of the day. That they don't put any labor in, they don't put any toil in, they don't put the proper time in of work and then feast and enjoy the work that they've toiled for. And he says, again, not for drunkenness. And then verse 18, he says, through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. The idea being that these people pursuing after pleasure in and of itself, which he's talked about before, and not doing the work that's been set before them, and then finding joy in the toil of their work, ultimately their life is left in shambles. Their roofs cave in. There's no place to live. They're ending up with nothing, and they're desolate, and because of their foolishness. He said, bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. This is a verse that, might be interesting to us today. But the idea being that the pursuit of those things are good, and ultimately it brings about joy. But they have to be pursued in their proper time, post-toil, post after you've actually worked, not prior. And then verse 20 gives kind of another thought of, even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich. For if the bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. The idea being is that don't get in the habit of speaking negatively about those who are your rulers, those who are over you, because it might get back to bite you. And to a certain extent, he's not wrong. And you want to make sure that when we're thinking properly, we're thinking with right measures. And that's why, even though we might disagree with our rulers, we might disagree with the rich, we might even disagree with how they manage things, and really how they treat others. We want to speak truth, speak to them, but we don't want to be using cursing. And that's what we talked about in our most recent sermon. The idea of being respectful to those in authority, respectful to those who are over us. However, we can still speak the truth to them, just like Paul did in Acts chapter 26. So, that's Ecclesiastes chapter 10. Again, some interesting wisdom from under the sun. Again, not necessarily divine wisdom in all circumstances, but from a perspective of someone living under the sun. God bless you all. Look forward to doing chapter 11 with you tomorrow, and we'll be taking a look at a little bit more in the text there. And looking forward to those of you who are able to make it to Family Discipleship Night this Friday. We're going to be doing that from 6 o'clock until around 7:30, and we're going to be talking about God as omnipresent. So God bless you all. Have a great evening.